Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments public workshop on the draft cancer inhalation unit risk factor for ethylene oxide. I'm Dr. Rima Woods, the acting section chief of the Air Toxicology and Risk Assessment section. And I'm joined by Dr. Kannan Krishnan, branch chief of the Air and Site Assessment and Climate Indicators branch. So a few logistics before we get started. This meeting is being recorded. For attendees here in the room, please remember to sign in at the back table. The restrooms are located out the doors down the hall and to the left. In case of an emergency, please exit at the back or side of the room and proceed downstairs and across the street to Cesar Chavez Park. For attendees listening in via webcast, please send your comments to public.workshop@oehha.ca.gov. If you would like to submit written comments, please visit our website at oeha.ca.gov/comments. OEHA is accepting written comments on this document until May 22nd. For today's agenda, we will hear a technical presentation on the draft cancer inhalation unit risk factor for ethylene oxide given by Dr. Krishnan. Then we will open the floor for public comments. Each speaker will be allowed up to 10 minutes to deliver their public comments for the record. Comments received from the webinar attendees will be read aloud as well. Again, those comments can be sent to public.workshop@oehha.ca.gov. The Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, also known as OEHA, is legislatively mandated to develop guidelines for conducting health risk assessments under the Air Toxics Hotspots program. In implementing this requirement, OEHA derives inhalation unit risk factors, or IURs, for carcinogenic hotspot air pollutants. IURs are used to estimate lifetime cancer risks associated with inhalation exposure to carcinogens. The focus of today's workshop is the draft document released on April 7th, which updates OEHA's cancer unit risk factor for ethylene oxide under the Air Toxics Hotspots program. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Krishnan to get started on the presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, Rima, for the introduction. I'll be making this presentation on the cancer inhalation unit risk for ethylene oxide, reflecting the draft document that was released on April 7th by OEHA. The current IUR for ethylene oxide was derived in 1987 when OEHA was part of CDHS, California Department of Health Services, and was based on animal cancer studies. Since then, the knowledge base has grown and hence the update. The OEHA draft document is in public review and the comment period closes on May 22nd, 2023. Information on how to engage in the public review process is contained in our website. So, ethylene oxide is a gas at normal temperature and pressure, actually a colorless gas with a sweet ether-like odor with a high odor threshold, as indicated here, about 430 ppm or so. Highly soluble in organic solvents and miscible with water, has a low boiling point of 10.7 degrees centigrade and a high vapor pressure of over 1,000 mm mercury at 20 degrees centigrade. Here are some of the key listings. Ethylene oxide is identified as a carcinogen under California Proposition 65. And the United States Environmental Protection Agency, US EPA, concluded that ethylene oxide is carcinogenic to humans. And the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, designated ETO as a Group 1 carcinogen, or carcinogenic to humans. Based on limited evidence in humans, sufficient evidence in animals, supported by strong evidence of genotoxic mechanism. In terms of its uses, in the US, ethylene oxide is predominantly used as an intermediate in producing other chemicals. And in California, it is used as a sterilizer for medical and laboratory equipment and supplies, as well as a fumigant for agricultural products such as herbs and spices. Regarding ethylene oxide emissions in California, there's limited data on ETO emissions. It's reportable under the Hotspots program. And the California Air Resources Board reported a total of 556 pounds of ETO emissions statewide for 2020, for the year 2020. As can be seen in the CEDARS database, the California Emissions Inventory Data Analysis and Reporting System database using publicly available search tool. Non-occupational ethylene oxide exposure results from cigarette smoke and ambient air. Ethylene oxide in ambient air is thought to result from a variety of non-point sources, such as fossil fuel combustion and release from residues in consumer products, including, fumigated food products and skincare products. An ethylene oxide air monitoring conducted by South Coast Air Quality Management District, SCAQMD, from summer 2022 to winter 2023 showed ambient concentrations ranging from 0.02 to 0.17 ppb in South Coast Air Basin. More localized monitoring near two medical sterilizer facilities revealed elevated concentrations ranging from undetectable to concentrations as high as 139 and 103 parts per billion, as referenced in the draft document. The absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion, or the toxicokinetics of ethylene oxide, is well characterized and known. There are also physiologically based pharmacokinetic models that integrate the available data on these processes, and they show approximately equal blood concentrations across species, across humans, rats, and mice, over a limited exposure range, like less than 100 ppm or so. And in that range, the blood concentration is linearly related to inhaled concentration as well. In terms of absorption, it's efficiently absorbed into blood through the respiratory tract, and the absorption is influenced primarily by ventilation rate or the breathing rate and the air concentration due to its solubility in blood. And the distribution of ethylene oxide in the body is rapid and fairly uniform throughout the body, with ethylene oxide binding readily to proteins and DNA in tissues throughout the body. It's metabolized through two pathways, hydrolysis and glutathione conjugation. Hydrolysis mediated by epoxide hydrolase as well as non-enzymatic are the primary pathway in humans, and it leads to the formation of ethylene glycol. And the glutathione conjugation mediated by glutathione S transferase enzyme is a primary pathway in rodents. Radioactivity studies based on recovery in the rats, recovery of the radioactivity, have shown that ethylene oxide is primarily eliminated via the urine and exhaled air, as you see the high percentages in this slide. And the approximate ethylene oxide elimination half-lives in blood are about 40 minutes in humans, 10 to 19 minutes in rats, and about 9 minutes in mice, so smaller animals eliminating it faster. Ethylene oxide is known to be produced endogenously. The endogenous production of ethylene oxide results from cytochrome P450 mediated conversion of ethylene in humans as well as in other mammals. And this ethylene oxide resulting from the endogenous source contributes to the adduct levels in the body, such as the N2-hydroxyethylvaline, a hemoglobin adduct used as an exposure biomarker. The endogenous ethylene production arises from the oxidation of hemoglobin and oxidative destruction of methionine or lipid peroxidation of fatty acids, as well as metabolism of intestinal bacteria. These are all relatively well-characterized phenomena and known to contribute to ethylene production in the body. Thus, all species and individuals are likely exposed to ethylene oxide endogenously, irrespective of their exposure to exogenous sources in the air. However, the percentage of ethylene converted to ethylene oxide, particularly as it relates to the endogenous source, is not very well characterized or known. But based on the exogenous ethylene data, one could assume about a 3% conversion to ethylene oxide. Conversion of ethylene to ethylene oxide. So the endogenously produced ethylene oxide is known to contribute to the ADAC levels, including the hemoglobin ADAC levels, and is part of the risk factors accounting for the background cancer risk in the population as well. Now, regarding the genotoxicity, it has been extensively reviewed based on data in a number of in vitro and in vivo studies reported from a variety of species as well. US EPA in 2016 summarized that there is clear evidence of genotoxicity and sufficient weight of evidence to support a mutagenic mode of action for ethylene oxide's carcinogenicity. And IARC, in its monographs evaluating the weight of evidence, stated that there is strong evidence for a genotoxic mechanism and that ethylene oxide acts consistently as a mutagen and clastogen at all phylogenetic levels. And ATSDR, in its 2022 publication, recognized that ethylene oxide has been demonstrated to be genotoxic in human and animal studies in vivo, and also in a variety of in vitro studies and systems. In the updated literature search, OIHA identified 3 additional studies published since 2016, that is published since the US EPA review was conducted and completed in 2016. And those are also consistent with the overall evidence that I just summarized earlier in this slide. So here's a synthesis of evidence for ethylene oxide-induced genetic and related damage in humans, human cells, and animals, as developed by IARC and published in 2012. It ranges from the ADAC formation through to the cytogenetic alterations in somatic cells, including sister chromatid exchange, structural chromosomal aberrations, and micronucleus formation. And all of this is consistent with ethylene oxide being a known alkylating agent and direct-acting mutagen. Now, moving on to the cancer hazard evaluation. It's been undertaken by a number of national and international agencies. IARC in 2012 designated ethylene oxide as carcinogenic to humans based on limited evidence in humans, sufficient evidence in animals supported by strong evidence of a genotoxic mechanism. And NTP 2021 concluded ethylene oxide is known to be a human carcinogen, and EPA 2016 characterized it as carcinogenic to humans based on strong but less than conclusive epidemiological evidence, extensive evidence in animals, clear evidence of genotoxicity with a mutagenic mode of action, and strong evidence that key precursor events are anticipated to occur in humans and progress to tumors. And OIHA agrees with these conclusions, with the conclusions of these 3 agencies regarding the carcinogenicity as indicated in the draft. And in the quantitative cancer risk assessment that's been conducted and in terms of updating the IUR for ethylene oxide, the draft in public review now presents the OIHA's update, and it is based on US EPA's 2016 analysis of the exposure-response relationship. WEHA concurs in this regard that human epidemiological studies are more relevant and sensitive than animal studies for ethylene oxide. And the NIOSH study that I'll be referring to momentarily is a high quality and is the best available study for conducting exposure response analysis. The two-piece linear spline model is the best fitting and most accurate model for assessing the cancer risks of ethylene oxide, and that there's been no new scientific information necessitating a change to US EPA's IUR, or the inhalation unit risk for ethylene oxide, that was published in 2016. So WEHA used the US EPA's assessment as the primary source of studies for studies published before 2016, and updated the literature review between January 2016 and January 2023 to identify more recent studies relevant to the development of IUR. And as you will see, the key study, or the key studies that form the basis of the EPA assessment are essentially the same in this document or in our draft document on ethylene oxide as well. So this is a Steenland et al. 2003-2004 epidemiological study. This is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH study, which is it's a retrospective cohort study including 17,530 workers from 13 US sterilization facilities in the exposure response analysis. It's considered as a high quality study both by US EPA as well as by WEHA, given the fact that this is the largest existing cohort of ethylene oxide exposed workers and noted for the quality of exposure estimates, the cohort size, inclusion of women, multiple study locations, and absence of co-exposures. And the NIOSH study was also reviewed by WEHA using the Bradford Hill guidelines for causal inference and National Toxicology Program, NTP's risk of bias tool, and determined to be of high quality and unlikely to be affected by important bias or confounding. And in this study, actually comprised of workers involved in sterilizing medical supplies, treating spices, and or manufacturing and testing medical sterilizers. And the study analyzed for lymphohematopoietic cancers, and in particular for lymphoid cancer that included non-Hodgkin lymphoma, NHL, myeloma, and lymphocytic leukemia, as well as breast cancer incidence in females. Cancer and mortality were followed up. The follow-up was through December 31st, 1998, the date of death or breast cancer diagnosis, or the date of loss to follow-up, whichever was earlier. In terms of the exposure assessment, the workplace in these studies, it captured on the workplace ethylene oxide measurements that were acquired between 1976 and 1985 in these sterilization facilities that included 2,700 individual time-weighted exposure values for workers' personal breath zones. And the estimated individual, the exposure estimates for early exposures, meaning that when no measurements were available, earlier than 76, when no measurements were available, those were determined using a regression model. So the estimated individual ethylene oxide exposures using a regression model then was done on the basis of information on the facility, the exposure category, and time period. In terms of the modeling considerations, fundamentally the extra risk was computed on the basis of the lifetime risk in the exposed population with reference to the risk in the unexposed population, that is R0, which refers to the background risk. And the risk estimates were calculated using the beta regression coefficients and the life table analysis that accounted for the competing causes of death. So in this slide, I'm summarizing and bringing out these aspects from the EPA's analysis. So apart from the life table analysis, the risks were computed for up to 85 years of age, and the conversion between occupational and environmental exposures were made to account for the difference in the number of days, 242 versus 365 days, as well as the volume of air inhaled per day between workers and general population as 10 meter cube per day versus 20 meter cube per day. So using this key epidemiological study and the IURs, or the inhalation unit risks, had been estimated or determined by EPA initially using various exposure response models. It included log linear exposure response models, and consideration of different lag periods and different mathematical transformations of the exposure variable, so forth. And EPA in its analysis concluded that a two-piece linear regression spline model with a knot at 1600 ppm days provided the best fit to the underlying NIOSH study data, especially in the lower exposure region, for the lymphoid cancer. And OIHA found that none of the other exposure response models that OIHA attempted, which were linear regression, weighted least squares regression, and generalized least squares regression, none of them fit the underlying NIOSH data better than the two-piece spline model selected by EPA. So that's why we decided to go with the results of the EPA analysis. As shown in the next slide, the solid line here shows the fit of the two-piece linear spline model with the knot at the 1600 ppm day level. So you see the knot is where you see the second slope in the solid line here. This is for the lymphoid cancer. Now, to derive the IUR, the lower 95% confidence limit on the effective concentration associated with the 1% extra risk was used as the basis. So that can be viewed as the point of departure, which is reasonable when you think about an epidemiological study. And using the life table analysis and the lower spline segment from the two-piece linear spline model, a linear low-dose extrapolation was conducted from the LEC01 to get an IUR for the lymphoid cancer incidence, 5.26 per ppm. And we replicated this EPA's analysis, the life table analysis, as well as the IUR calculation, and obtained the same results. And that's what we have reported in the draft document. Then in terms of the breast cancer exposure response and IUR calculations, the EPA analysis chose the two-piece linear spline regression model, much similar to what we just heard and saw with the lymphoid cancer. And once again, this was based on cumulative exposure, a 15-year exposure lag, and a knot at 5,750 ppm days for breast cancer, as I will show in the next slide. We have evaluated other exposure response models, as I alluded to before, and none of the models resulted in a better visual fit or had a lower p-values than the two-piece linear spline model selected by EPA. So we have concluded that EPA's two-piece linear spline model is the most appropriate exposure response model for estimating the breast cancer risks for ethylene oxide. So this figure shows the relative risk estimates for breast cancer incidence with a 15-year lag. And you can see the solid line here corresponds to the line obtained with the linear two-piece spline model with the knot at 5,750 ppm days. That's where you see the second slope. So the estimate for breast cancer is also from the breast cancer incidence in the same occupational cohort and using the same life table approach as with the lymphoid cancer, the lower spline segment from the two-piece linear spline model, as well as linear low-dose extrapolation from the LEC01, an IUR for breast cancer incidence of 0.148 per ppm was obtained, and as I indicated before, same as was obtained based on the adult exposures by EPA. So the adult exposure-based ethylene oxide cancer inhalation unit risk is 3.3, 10 to the minus 3 per microgram per meter cube, or 6.1, 10 to the minus 3 per ppb. And it combines the lymphoid cancer in males and females as well as the breast cancer in females. And the IUR describes the excess cancer risk, that is a risk over and above the background risk associated with inhalation exposure to an ethylene oxide concentration of 1 microgram per meter cube, shown in this slide. And then here is the conversion and expression in terms of the cancer slope factor as per WEIHA 2009 technical support document for cancer potency factors, and that is 12 per milligram kilo day, which is derived based on the IUR that you saw in the previous slide. So the inhalation unit risk and the cancer slope factor describe excess cancer risk, risk over and above the background associated with the unit exposure, unit concentration or unit dose, respectively. And the background risk includes cancer risk due to endogenous exposures, and the IUR and the CSF presented here are meant for use in computing risk levels associated with the non-zero exogenous exposures. With that, I want to indicate that the public comments period closes on May 22nd, and written comments can be submitted online at the address given below, oeha.ca.gov. /comments, I have to put a dot there. And they can also be submitted via email. That I'll turn it over to you and open for any comments from the attendees online or in person.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnan. So we'll now open the floor for public comments. So for those of you in the room, we do have a microphone. We'll bring it over to you. Start with your name and affiliation. And for any online comments, we will be reading those as well as we receive them.
Thank you very much. Real quick question, will Dr. Krishnan's slides be available?
Yes, they will be posted online on our website. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me start. My name is Bill Gullidge. I'm with the American Chemistry Council, and I'm here today to represent ACC's ethylene oxide panel. The ethylene oxide panel is composed of the major producers and users of ethylene oxide in North America. And so As I go through my comments, I may use the term EO instead of ETO. I know ETO is pretty common, but in the industry, most of the manufacturing companies use the term EO. First, let me start by saying that we would like an extension to the comment period for this proposal and also for the Prop 65 proposal. The issues are quite complex. There's a lot of data to review, and I know our review is far from complete. So if you're putting a number to it, if it's possible to get a 45-day extension, that would be very, very helpful. I can confirm that in writing if that would be preferable, but however you want to do it. Yeah. Okay.
Sure, we would enter it into the record here, and if you'd also like to submit it as a written comment, that would be helpful as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to provide this information in the workshop. I thought the presentation was good. Overall comment, he appears to be accepting the IRIS value on face value. And you saw the proposal, the number, and it's pretty much utilizing the potency parameters from the US EPA analysis. OHIA did consider 2 IURs. One was developed by the Texas TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and of course the other by EPA and the IRIS value. It uses the same NIOSH cohort, but we, the panel and ACC, we strongly support the scientific approach used by TCEQ. We believe it emphasizes biological plausibility and mode of action as the guiding principles, and is based on corrected statistics and objective criteria for model fit that we think EPA did not accurately present. The IRIS value is based on the selection of a statistical model that is steeper at lower concentrations compared to higher exposures. This means that's the superlinear 2-piece spline model that Dr. Krishnan was just going over. It gives rise to one of the highest cancer potency estimates among those previously derived by IRIS. The value is highly implausible based on epidemiological, toxicological, and biological mode of action evidence, and most importantly, the original NIOSH published conclusions. The selection of the IRIS model was based almost exclusively on the fundamentally flawed statistical analysis and a flawed assessment of the visual fit in relationship to categorical or grouped model estimates without consideration of biological plausibility. In contrast, we think that the TCEQ provided an objective method, including several reality checks, to ensure that the statistical model selected best reflects the epidemiological and biological evidence and is adequately protective of cancer risk. We'll elaborate more on our written comments and provide additional weight of evidence to further support the TCEQ approach. OHIA's reliance on EPA's IRIS 2016 model and conclusions results in the same flaws and the subsequent IUR. While he attempts to conduct an independent evaluation of bias in EPA's model and the NIOSH data, the efforts and inadequate data due to questionable assumptions in the absence of access to the actual data being considered, it creates an issue, and then therefore mimics EPA's faulty reasoning. So here's some additional information. In reviewing the cancer data, the original NIOSH study upon which OHIA's IUR is based found no statistical significance in males at lower cancer rate in males at lower categories of exposures, and concluded that there were no effects in females in the lymphoid cancers. The TCEQ dose response model is more consistent with the original findings of the NIOSH study. OHIA's rationale for supporting the IRIS model selection is based on uncritical acceptance of EPA statistics. OHIA falls victim to the IRIS misleading graphs by visually comparing or eyeballing whether graphs of different models are lower or higher than the categorical group model, despite the clear warning in EPA's footnotes in their graph that such comparisons along with the y-axis should not be made. OHIA accepted EPA's flawed criticism of TCEQ, we feel, more objective and scientifically sound method of evaluating the fit of the models compared to EPA's visual fit method, using graphs that were really not fit for that purpose. Another flaw with IRIS is how pre-1978 exposures are handled. Basically, EPA set pre-1978 exposures at the 1978 level. However, the real exposures during that time period were much higher. More importantly, several states then have, so if you take that, it of course leads to mistakes in the modeling. But more importantly, several states have now compared cancer data to measured concentrations of ethylene oxide in specific locations and concluded no significant increase in cancer rates are present. I mentioned the reality check. In other words, the potency of EO as a carcinogen. That has been addressed by some of the more recent papers and supported by the state cancer data. So we would argue that there have been more data available since 2016, that data does argue against the superlinear two-spline model. Exogenous and endogenous background EO exposures provide an important reality check on the utility of EO's proposed risk factors, and also the NRSL in managing general population risk, but are dismissed by OHIA for reasons that we believe are not correct and unsupported by the relevant toxicokinetic models, and in CDC NHANES data that's come out, and animal data reported in detail by Dr. Chris Kerman and his colleagues in their 2021 paper. The methods used by Kerman in 2016 to estimate exposures together with recent data from the CDC NHANES allows several important lines of evidence that support a potency closer to TCEQ than EPA. For example, one line of evidence that is inconsistent with a high cancer potency for ethylene oxide is that EO is a component of cigarette smoke. It is well known that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer and other cancer types. However, cigarette smoking is not associated with NHL, which is the most significant cancer type driving EPA's potency estimate for ethylene oxide, as Dr. Kristen pointed out. The lack of association between cigarette smoking and NHL is confirmed by IARC and in other review articles in the literature. This is basically inconsistent with EPA's potency estimate. Dr. Kristen pointed out that ethylene oxide is formed in the human body. Endogenous formation includes processes such as a bacterial production in the gastrointestinal tract or systemic formation in the liver. While EPA's potency estimate technically only applies to exposures above endogenous levels, it is implausible that a chemical would be a potent carcinogen at levels that the body produces through natural processes. Another important, perhaps more significant point is that there are significant background levels of EO in the atmosphere that are not due to sterilization facility emissions or anything to do with ethylene oxide production or use. Extensive ambient air measurements have been made over the last several years in multiple states, including measurements near many sterilizer facilities. In many cases, the levels, I should say, of ethylene oxide Here we go. In many cases, where was I? The levels of ethylene oxide far away from sterilized facilities are similar to levels near the facilities. The source of this background ethylene oxide is really not clear. However, what is clear is that in many cases, residents living near sterilizer facilities may not be exposed to higher ethylene oxide levels than people living far away. There are many lines of evidence that cast doubt on EPA's conclusion that EO has a high cancer potency, and others, including the state of Texas, have come to substantially different conclusions using the same information. Thank you for your time today. I'll just say happy Cinco de Mayo, everybody.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gullidge. I will now check online to see if we've received any comments from any of our remote attendees. It looks like at this time we have not received any comments from any of our remote attendees. We'll wait just a minute or two to give the remote attendees some time to get their comments submitted. So if you are listening into the webcast, please send your comment in to our public workshop email address, which is public.workshop at oehha.ca.gov. And as a reminder, you can also submit written comments on our website, and that website address is oehha.ca.gov/comments.
I heard you say that you'll be sending the comments in writing. We're submitting written comments. Okay.
Your microphone back?
Thank you. Yes, we will be submitting written comments and also requests for extension for the comment period. But I didn't have time to go over all the technical issues we want to raise in our comments. And I know you talked about the breast cancer incident rates and the data there. We'll elaborate that on that in our written comments as well.
Thank you.
Okay, at this time, we still have no comments from remote attendees. So if we have no further business, we will go ahead and conclude today's public workshop. Thank you very much for attending. And thank you to all the remote attendees as well.